I remember the day my parents told me the money for my college tuition was gone. It felt like a punch to the gut, the kind that leaves you gasping for air and frantically searching for the ground beneath your feet. I'd just come home from a volunteer shift at the local animal shelter, where I'd spent hours feeding puppies and cleaning cages. Normally, I'd be glowing from the small satisfaction of making a difference. But that day, as I stepped into the living room, I saw my parents waiting with somber faces. Something was definitely wrong. My father was always the stoic one, rarely showing emotion beyond mild amusement or quiet annoyance. My mother, on the other hand, often fussed over every detail of my life, my grades, my friends, my future. Yet, that afternoon, the two of them looked unnervingly aligned. They made me sit, and Dad began speaking in a measured tone. He explained that after my sister Tessa started community college, they'd needed a reliable car for her commute. So, they tapped into my college fund, and then, well, life took over. A few lavish family vacations later, the money was simply gone. I couldn't wrap my head around it. This was the fund they'd mentioned ever since I was old enough to understand what college was, the one they'd promised to nourish through wise financial planning and incremental savings. My father had boasted about how I'd never have to worry about tuition because, as he put it, we've got your back. Now, that security was shattered. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious. Meanwhile, they both sat there, almost expecting me to nod along and accept it like a minor inconvenience. I felt my throat tighten until I could barely speak. Then came the real shocker. My parents suggested I take a gap year, basically just not attend college for the next 12 months. In their eyes, it was a brilliant solution. They said I could save money, maybe work somewhere interesting, or figure out a new plan. But all I heard was a dismissal of every dream I'd nurtured. My acceptance letters were already pinned to my bulletin board, a testament to hours of study and countless extracurriculars. To abandon that path felt like failing. I kept picturing my classmates heading off to campus while I stayed stuck at home. My sister Tessa stood by the staircase. She wore the same expression she'd had when she was 10 and got caught cutting her own hair. Guilty, but defiant. I glared at her, silently cursing the sleek new car parked in the driveway, the one I suspected I'd just unwillingly financed. She tried to meet my gaze, but her eyes darted to the floor. I didn't know whether to blame her for not declining such a costly gift or to pity her for being used as a pawn. Either way, resentment mingled with sadness, poisoning every breath I took. That night, I locked myself in my room, ignoring the world. My phone buzzed incessantly with well-meaning texts from friends congratulating me on my acceptance letters. The messages turned my stomach. I was too mortified to tell them the truth. My future, once a bright tapestry of possibility, now seemed torn beyond repair. I tried to crunch numbers, scribbling down tuition costs, potential part-time earnings, and the meager sum left in my personal savings. Even with scholarships, I was still thousands short. I wondered if I could navigate student loans on my own, but my parents' credit issues would complicate everything. Over the next few days, I oscillated between numb defeat and fiery determination. Sometimes, I wanted to march up to my parents, demand an explanation for how they could squander my future so carelessly, and refuse to budge until they found a way to fix it. Other times, I felt strangely resigned, as though I'd never really had control in the first place. My mother tried to console me, offering half-baked promises that they'd eventually pay it back. But her eyes darted around nervously, betraying her own uncertainty. My father, ever the stoic, avoided the conversation altogether. School ended and summer arrived, bringing with it the questions. Where would I go in the fall? Was I actually going to give up and skip college? I found myself wandering aimlessly around town, working part-time at the local bookstore to scrape together a few pennies. My boss, Melissa, noticed my gloom. When I finally confessed the story, she stared at me with a mixture of pity and outrage. She offered me more hours, but it still wouldn't be enough to cover out-of-state tuition. The best she could do was let me work close to 40 hours once I graduated. Tessa tried to talk to me one afternoon. She found me slumped on the couch, scanning scholarship websites on my laptop. She whispered an apology, said she didn't realize Mom and Dad were draining my fund to such an extent. She claimed she would have insisted on a cheaper car if she had known. I wanted to believe her. I really did, but a bitter part of me couldn't forgive her so easily. She had to have noticed something was off. Still, there was no point in lashing out, so I muttered a tight-lipped, "Thanks for telling me," and kept typing. Aunt Simone called me not long after. She'd heard through the family grapevine that I was in some sort of financial predicament. I hadn't shared the full story with extended relatives, but apparently my mother had let slip that I might take a year off. Aunt Simone was livid on my behalf. She offered to loan me a few $1,000s, but it wasn't nearly enough. When I hesitated, not wanting to burden her, she insisted. I cried tears of gratitude, though deep inside, I questioned whether taking her money would just deepen the family rift. Still, it was a start. With a renewed sense of hope, I started piecing together every possible resource. The partial scholarships I'd already earned, my meager savings, the money from Aunt Simone. Maybe I could swing at least one semester. If I got a campus job, I might survive. Every day, I hunted for more scholarships, applying to obscure ones that required essays on everything from community service to creative writing. Meanwhile, I dreaded the conversations with my parents. They doubled down on the gap year suggestion, citing that it was the mature thing to do. I bristled at their audacity, given how we'd arrived at this mess. July rolled around, and I'd just come home from a long shift. Mom was in the kitchen, slicing tomatoes in silence. Dad was pacing near the fridge, a pile of bills clutched in his hand. Tessa, thankfully, was out. I grabbed a glass of water and braced myself. I told them I planned to enroll for the fall semester at Redwood University. It was an in-state college, not as prestigious as some of my other options, but they'd given me decent scholarship money. I explained that I had enough saved for the first semester, though I'd be relying on campus work study. Mom sighed, as though I was an unruly child refusing to see reason. She muttered something about not being able to bail me out if I fell behind on payments. Dad nodded, solemnly warning me about student loan debt. They spoke like wise mentors who had always guided me responsibly, ignoring the elephant in the room. It was their poor financial decisions that had forced me into this corner. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. Did they honestly believe they were protecting me by urging me to quit before I'd even started? My frustration boiled, but I kept calm. In August, I packed my modest belongings into a friend's hatchback. My parents were nowhere to be seen, which stung more than I'd expected. Tessa helped me carry a few boxes to the car, her face etched with guilt. She tried to give me a goodbye hug, but I shrugged it off, mumbling that I'd see her later. Part of me regretted that immediate reaction, but the wound was too fresh to pretend everything was fine. We drove off, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. I was actually doing this. I was leaving home for college. When I arrived on campus, the sight of new dorm buildings and excited first-year students gave me a jolt of optimism. I collected my dorm key, a crinkled map of the campus, and a welcome packet. My roommate, Michelle, came from 2 states away and seemed both bubbly and considerate, a combination that helped ease my nerves. She had no idea about my family drama, and I chose to keep it that way, for now, at least. I wanted a fresh start, free from the shame and resentment that clung to me like a stubborn shadow. My first few weeks at Redwood were a whirlwind of orientation events, friend-making attempts, and constant reminders that I couldn't spend money frivolously. While other students were sampling local restaurants or joining pricey clubs, I stayed frugal. I scouted the cafeteria for free meal plans, learned to love peanut butter sandwiches, and borrowed textbooks from the library whenever possible. The only exception was my job interview for the campus bookstore, which ironically reminded me of my part-time gig back home. When I got the position, I nearly cried with relief. It offered enough hours to at least buy groceries and supplies. Classes started. My major was undecided, but I leaned toward sociology or psychology, fields that fascinated me, especially now that I'd experienced a crash course in how family dynamics can unravel. I threw myself into my studies with fervor, determined to prove I deserved to be there. Despite the chaos at home, I felt a sense of liberation. For the first time, I was forging my own path. My parents' voices, urging me to take a gap year, lingered in my memory, but they grew quieter with each successful homework assignment and each new friend I made. Money, however, remained a struggle. Even with scholarships, loans, and the bookstore job, I worried about the next semester's tuition. I'd poured everything into getting here, so if I couldn't sustain it financially, I'd be forced to drop out, just as my parents had predicted. That possibility haunted me. Every time I looked at the campus bulletin board for job postings, I felt a sick twist of anxiety. I took on some tutoring gigs, helping other freshmen with writing assignments. At night, I found myself counting pennies and recalculating budgets. It wasn't the carefree college life I'd once imagined. Sometimes, I caught myself feeling envious of Michelle, whose parents visited on weekends bearing groceries and moral support. She'd asked about my family, and I'd mumbled something vague about them being busy. The truth was, we hadn't spoken much since I left. Mom sent a brief text on move-in day, wishing me luck. Dad stayed silent, and Tessa occasionally sent me memes, an odd mixture of attempted camaraderie and leftover guilt. Meanwhile, I kept reading about their social media updates, pictures of day trips, fancy dinners, and Tessa's proud posts about her new car. It stung, but I tried to focus on me. As midterms approached, I discovered a surprising outlet, Redwood's counseling services. A friend suggested it after I admitted I was having trouble sleeping. At first, I scoffed at the idea of therapy, but something in me yearned for a place to vent. My counselor, Dr. Lee, listened attentively as I spilled the saga, the college fund betrayal, the vacations, the car, the forced gap year suggestion. She didn't judge me. She simply helped me unravel the anger and shame, teaching me coping strategies. It felt oddly comforting to voice my resentment out loud and have someone affirm that I'd been wronged. With renewed clarity, I pushed through midterms, scoring higher than I expected. My hard work was paying off academically, even though my finances remained precarious. I also began to view Tessa in a slightly different light. Maybe she was just as much a victim of our parents' recklessness, albeit in a different way. She'd been given the car, sure, but she hadn't asked them to gut my savings. The real fault lay with the people who claimed to love both of us equally, yet set us up for conflict. That revelation didn't erase my anger, but it softened the edges. Late one evening, I was studying in the library when I received a call from my mother. My heart pounded as I answered. She sounded distraught, muttering about looming credit card bills and the fear of losing the house. Their vacations and car payments had caught up with them. She asked if there was any way I could spare some money from my scholarships or part-time job. I nearly dropped the phone in disbelief. They'd blown my college fund, forced me to fend for myself, and now wanted me to rescue them? I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. "Mom, I barely have enough for next semester's tuition," I said, my voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying that family supported one another, especially in tough times. Tears threatened to spill from my eyes, but I bit them back. For so long, I'd felt obligated to please them. I'd believed it was my duty to be the good child, to accept their decisions with grace. But something in me snapped. I quietly told her I couldn't help and that I was done sacrificing my future for their mistakes. Then, I hung up. That night, I didn't sleep. Memories of childhood birthdays and holiday gatherings collided with fresh images of my mother's pleading voice. A small part of me wanted to fix everything, to be the hero who kept our family afloat. But I knew that path would lead to my own ruin. The next morning, I called Tessa. She sounded worn out, complaining that she, too, was getting asked for money she didn't have. For once, we shared a moment of mutual understanding. Our parents had mismanaged their finances so badly that now both of us were in precarious positions. Finals arrived, and I channeled my turmoil into studying relentlessly. I ended the semester with a solid GPA, ensuring I'd keep my scholarships. I even got a small merit-based award for my research paper on socioeconomic inequalities. With careful budgeting, I registered for the spring semester. Christmas break loomed, and I considered going home, but I decided against it. Instead, Michelle invited me to spend a few days with her family. They knew my situation only in broad strokes, yet they welcomed me warmly. Sitting around their dinner table, I realized families could choose to nurture one another, or they could choose to betray. As I laughed with Michelle's siblings, a wave of bittersweet gratitude washed over me. One morning in January, I opened my email to find that I'd been awarded a scholarship for my volunteer work. The amount was more than I'd hoped, ensuring my continued path. For once, my future felt mine.